They saw a woman with a silk scarf and a quiet expression, never realizing I was the deadliest thing on this flight. I wasn't just a passenger caught in an organized scheme. I was the only person in the cabin capable of turning this hijacking into a graveyard for those who underestimated me. The cabin of the flight from Dulles to Nairobi smelled like stale coffee and the recycled air of 1,000 tired travelers. I sat in seat 14A, my laptop tucked away, my eyes closed, and my breathing regulated to the slow, rhythmic pace of a civilian taking a long-haul nap. Most people see me and assume I'm a corporate consultant or perhaps a high-end travel blogger. They see the designer silk scarf, the minimalist gold watch, and the calm, neutral expression. They don't see the encrypted drive taped to the inside of my thigh, nor the tracking beacon sewn into the lining of my carry-on. My name is Elena, and I don't exist. At least, not on any tax return or public census that matters. For the last 6 months, I had been tracking a complex network of financiers moving untraceable funds through East Africa. This wasn't a standard diplomatic shuttle. I was carrying intelligence that could dismantle a global scheme involving the movement of illicit technology and human trafficking rings. I had to look bored, tired, and utterly unthreatening. That was my armor. Then came the rustle of a service cart and a sharp, metallic clack of a tray table being shoved back into place. "Ma'am, I said your bag needs to be under the seat, not in the overhead, not on your lap. Under the seat." The voice was dripping with a synthetic, customer service-approved venom. I opened my eyes slowly. Standing in the aisle was a flight attendant with a name tag that read, Sarah. Her skin was perfectly pale, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes into a perpetual, judgmental squint. She was staring at my leather tote, the one containing the physical dossier I couldn't risk uploading to the cloud. "My apologies," I said, my voice soft, maintaining the persona of a weary traveler. "The floor space is occupied by the ventilation unit. I'll keep it on my lap." Sarah didn't move. She leaned in, her gaze lingering on my face with a look of undisguised irritation. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me, scanning me for reasons to be offended. I realized then that this wasn't about the bag. It was about me being a black woman sitting in a premium economy seat, and the sheer audacity of my presence clearly chafed at her worldview. "I don't make the rules, honey," she snapped, loud enough for the passengers in the nearby rows to glance over. "But I do enforce them. People who look like you usually have a hard time grasping simple instructions. Put it under the seat, or I'll have security remove you before we even leave the tarmac." I felt the familiar, cold flicker of adrenaline in my gut. My training screamed at me to diffuse, to de-escalate, to remain invisible. But Sarah's eyes held a specific kind of malice that suggested she enjoyed the power play. She moved her hand, not to reach for my bag, but to tap the plastic casing of the seat, her fingers lingering near my knee. "I have already told you," I said, my voice steady, my posture relaxed, "that there is no room. I will happily move it if you find me a seat where the underseat storage isn't obstructed." Sarah let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you'd love an upgrade, wouldn't you? Someone like you usually does." She leaned down, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of peppermint and hostility. "You know, we've had reports of people trying to smuggle contraband on this flight lately. If you don't move that bag this instant, I'm going to call the internal security team. And believe me, they aren't going to be as polite as I am. They'll search every inch of you, and they'll find whatever it is you're trying to sneak into the country." My heart rate didn't spike, but my focus sharpened. She wasn't just being a bigot, she was being a potential obstacle to a mission of national security importance. If she pushed this to security, they would search my luggage. They would find the specialized equipment, the burner phones, and the encrypted documents. My life, and the lives of my entire team, depended on this flight remaining invisible. "I suggest you walk away, Sarah," I said, my tone shifting just a fraction of a degree colder. "You have no idea who you're talking to, and you have no idea what is at stake on this aircraft." Sarah smirked, standing up straight and tapping her intercom button. "Yeah? Let's see what the air marshals have to say about that. You think you're a big deal?" You're just another target for the authorities." As she turned to flag down a colleague, I saw the reflection in the galley mirror. A man 3 rows back had stood up. He wasn't part of the crew. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than my salary, but his eyes were darting around the cabin with the mechanical precision of a predator. He reached into his jacket, his hand lingering near a hidden compartment where a piece of illegal weaponry would typically be holstered. My stomach dropped. The flight was compromised. And as Sarah gestured toward me, smiling with the joy of a woman about to ruin someone's life, the man in the suit began to walk toward us, his hand moving toward his waistband. The air in the cabin grew heavy, pressurized by more than just the altitude. As the man in the tailored suit moved down the aisle, his stride was too measured, too deliberate. He wasn't a traveler heading to the restroom. He was an interceptor. Behind me, I could hear Sarah whispering into her radio, her voice smug and triumphant. She had already decided my fate, convinced that her prejudice was giving her the moral high ground to call for help. Little did she know, the help she was summoning would be the very thing that triggered a disaster neither of us was prepared to handle. I kept my hands visible, resting them on my tray table, my fingers splayed in a gesture of non-resistance. My mind was already running through the exit vectors. The plane was still at the gate. The doors hadn't been armed yet. If I could deplane, I might lose the tail, but the intel in my bag would be seized by the local authorities, and the network I was hunting would vanish into the shadows of Nairobi before I could even rebook a flight. I had to stay on this bird. "Excuse me," the man in the suit said as he reached our row. He ignored Sarah completely, his gaze locking onto mine. He had the cold, dead eyes of a field operative, not from my agency, but from someone else's. "There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding your luggage, ma'am. Perhaps we should step into the galley area to discuss your travel documents?" Sarah beamed, her face flushed with the sick satisfaction of having successfully humiliated someone she deemed beneath her. "Thank you. She's been nothing but trouble. I'm sure you'll find that her documentation isn't nearly as clean as she thinks it is." I looked at the man. His jacket shifted slightly, revealing the hard, rectangular outline of illegal weaponry tucked into his inner pocket. He wasn't security, he was muscle. And Sarah, in her ignorance and bigotry, had essentially handed me over to a group that had been trying to intercept this mission for weeks. She thought she was being an effective attendant. In reality, she had just walked me into a trap. "I don't think that's necessary," I said, my voice projecting just enough to be heard by the passengers nearby, yet remaining perfectly controlled. "I have my passport and my transit visa right here. I'm sure my company would be very interested to hear why a passenger in a suit is taking over your duties, Sarah." "Oh, shut up," Sarah snapped, her mask of professional etiquette finally slipping entirely. "I'm tired of hearing your excuses. This man is with the service, and you're going to do exactly what he says." The man reached out, his hand gripping my shoulder with a pressure that was designed to be painful. It was a classic dominance move. He leaned down, his lips brushing my ear. "Don't make a scene," he whispered. "Walk with me to the back. If you struggle, I'll tell the crew you're carrying a package of forbidden substance and an illegal firearm. We have people on this flight who will swear they saw you loading the bag with something suspicious. You'll be detained, your life will be broken, and you'll spend decades behind bars for a heavy charge you didn't even commit. Do you understand?" He was threatening to frame me with a massive sentencing charge, utilizing the very prejudices Sarah was so eager to fuel. He knew exactly how the system worked. A black woman accused of transporting dangerous contraband on an international flight wouldn't even get a chance to explain herself before the authorities locked her away. "I have a better idea," I whispered back, my eyes flickering to the emergency release lever on the galley door just 3 feet away. "How about you let go of my arm, and I don't break your wrist in front of a full cabin of witnesses?" His grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. He didn't believe I was a threat. He looked at my petite frame, the silk scarf, the calm face, and he saw only the stereotype. He underestimated me, just like Sarah. And that was his final mistake. As he began to pull me into the aisle, I shifted my weight, dropping my center of gravity. I saw the flash of panic in his eyes as he realized his mistake a second too late. I grabbed his thumb, applying the exact amount of pressure needed to hyperextend the joint, and drove my elbow into his solar plexus with the force of a hydraulic press. He gasped, a sound choked off by the sudden loss of oxygen, and his hand flew from my shoulder. He stumbled backward, crashing into the service cart. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Sarah screamed, a high-pitched, jagged sound that instantly caused the rest of the plane to erupt into chaos. Passengers were standing up, some reaching for their phones, others trying to see what was happening. In the middle of the scramble, the man regained his footing, his hand diving into his jacket. He pulled out the illegal weapon, his face twisted in rage. He wasn't hiding it anymore. "Get down!" he roared, pointing the weapon toward the ceiling, his finger twitching on the trigger. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the man she had invited to help her was actually a threat. The plane was suddenly a pressure cooker, and I was at the center of the blast radius. Just as he turned the weapon toward me, I heard a dull, mechanical thud from the cockpit door. A second, much larger man stepped out into the aisle, wearing the same tactical attire as the first. The hijackers were no longer hiding their intent, and I realized with a sickening jolt that this wasn't just a simple extraction attempt. This was an active hijacking, and the cockpit had already been breached. The air grew thin as the reality settled over the cabin. Two men, their faces cold and devoid of human empathy, held the aisle captive. The passengers were paralyzed, pressed into their seats as if gravity had tripled. Sarah, the flight attendant who only moments ago had been fueling her own petty grievances, was now trembling, her face drained of color as she stared at the weapon pointed toward the cabin ceiling. She had invited the wolf into the house, thinking it was a guard dog, and now she was watching it prepare to tear the place apart. I didn't wait for them to secure the cabin. While the second man, a brute of a human being with a scar running down his jawline, was busy shouting orders at the front, I let my shoulder bag slide to the floor, partially hidden under the seat. I wasn't just a target. I was an asset. And assets are trained to survive. "Get your hands where I can see them," the second man yelled, his voice echoing off the curved ceiling. "Nobody moves, nobody calls for help, or this flight becomes a memorial service." I watched them both. They were professional enough to be dangerous, but they were sloppy in their arrogance. They expected the passengers to be a herd of sheep. They didn't count on the fact that I had spent the last decade studying the exact anatomy of these types of scenarios. I knew the weight of the handgun the first man held, and I knew the specific recoil pattern of that model. I knew where they were looking, and more importantly, where they weren't. Sarah began to sob. It was a rhythmic, pathetic sound that was grating on the nerves of the men. The first man, the one I had injured, swiped his hand toward her, his eyes blazing with lingering irritation from my previous attack. "Quiet! You, sit down! You're the one who caused all this mess. Keep your mouth shut!" He didn't know who I was. He thought I was just a civilian who happened to fight back. He didn't know I was the reason they were being watched. My heart was beating in a slow, calculated rhythm. I glanced at the floor. My bag was only a few inches away. Inside, beneath the files and the mundane travel supplies, was a high-frequency jamming device. It wouldn't stop bullets, but it would disrupt the shortwave radios these men were using to communicate with the network waiting on the ground in Nairobi. If I could bridge the gap to that bag, I could blind them. "You!" The man with the scar gestured toward me, his weapon swinging in my direction. "You're the one who hurt my partner. You think you're special, don't you? Let's see how special you are when we drag you into the cockpit and let you explain your mission to our lead." He was coming for me. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic step, his eyes fixed on my face with a hunger that had nothing to do with the mission. He was going to use me as a bargaining chip, a piece of leverage to ensure the plane landed on their terms. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands empty. Sarah let out a soft, choked gasp. "Don't," she whispered, a sudden spark of humanity flickering in her eyes. "He'll kill you." "He's going to try," I replied, my voice barely audible over the low whine of the jet engines. As the man reached my row, I didn't reach for my bag. Instead, I reached for the one thing he didn't expect, the emergency oxygen release above the seats. I had tracked the mechanical linkage during my pre-flight scan of the aircraft. With a swift, precise strike to the panel, the masks tumbled down with a collective hiss, filling the cabin with a sudden, chaotic cloud of rubber tubing and plastic. The element of surprise lasted for exactly 3 seconds. The men, blinded by the falling masks and the sudden mechanical noise, faltered. In that sliver of a heartbeat, I lunged not at the man, but at the light switch panel on the side wall. I slammed my palm against the emergency lighting reset, cutting the power to the main cabin lights. Darkness, thick and absolute, swallowed the plane. The only illumination came from the flashing red of the exit signs and the faint blue glow of the emergency lights. "Get him!" the first man shouted into the darkness, his voice tight with panic. I was already moving, sliding over the armrest and into the aisle. I felt the sharp whoosh of air as a bullet whistled past my ear, embedding itself into the headrest I had been occupying a moment before. The interior of the plane turned into a cacophony of screams and scrambling bodies. I hit the floor, belly crawling toward the galley, my fingers searching for the bag. My hand found the strap, and I pulled it toward me, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had the jammer, but I was out of time. The man with the scar was only a few feet away, his heavy boots thudding against the carpet as he hunted me through the dark. I heard the click-clack of his weapon being recocked. Suddenly, a bright, blinding light flared from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the plane's emergency system. It was a tactical flashbang detonated from the galley. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched ring that threatened to shatter my eardrums. My vision smeared into a white haze, and for a terrifying second, I felt the cold metal of a gun barrel press firmly against the back of my neck. "I've got her," a voice growled in my ear. "And I don't care who she's working for. She's dead." The cold steel pressed into my vertebrae, a lethal reminder that, for all my training, the margin between success and a shallow grave is measured in milliseconds. The flashbang had been a masterstroke, a tactical move that should have been mine. My lungs burned with the metallic tang of ozone and spent explosives. The man holding the weapon against my neck laughed, a low, wet sound that vibrated through my very marrow. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" he hissed, his grip tightening. He didn't know he was holding an officer of a secret government agency. He thought he was holding a liability. He was about to make a tactical error that would cost him everything. I didn't try to pull away. Instead, I let my body go limp, feigning total shock. As he leaned in to drag me to my feet, I triggered the jamming device I'd finally managed to pull from the bag. It wasn't a weapon, but the sudden, high-frequency pulse it emitted against his nearby comms headset was like a lightning strike to his ear canal. He howled, the weapon wavering for a fraction of a second. That was all I needed. I pivoted, using my shoulder to jam his arm upward and bringing my heel down into his instep with enough force to shatter bone. He lost his balance, and I spun away, diving behind the meal service trolley. The cabin was still in a state of absolute chaos. Sarah was curled in a fetal position on the floor, her eyes wide and staring at nothing, completely broken by the reality that the world she lived in was not as simple as she had demanded it to be. "Find her!" the man with the scar roared, his voice distorted and pained from the feedback of the jammer. "Kill her! I don't care if the plane loses pressure, just stop her!" I heard the frantic movement of boots against the thin carpet. They were closing in. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing the cool, solid weight of the secondary drive, the one containing the evidence that would blow the organized scheme wide open. I couldn't lose this. I wouldn't. I looked up, scanning the cabin. A group of passengers was huddled near the emergency exit, their faces reflecting the terror of an uncontrollable situation. I needed to move, but the aisles were choked with debris. The first man, the one I had injured earlier, was limping toward me, his gun raised, his eyes fixed on the gap between the seats where he knew I had taken cover. "You're done, lady," he snarled. "The flight crew is locked in the cockpit. Nobody is coming to save you, and we have enough explosive material on this plane to make sure no one ever finds your body." He was stalling for time, trying to rattle me. I saw him glance at his watch. They were waiting for a signal. They weren't just hijacking the plane, they were waiting for a specific altitude or coordinate to trigger the next phase of their operation. I looked at the flight deck door. It was reinforced, but it wasn't impenetrable if you knew the bypass sequence. "You think you're in control," I called out, my voice steady, betraying none of the fear that was gnawing at my resolve. "But you're just pawns. The people you work for have already wiped your digital footprints. The moment this plane hits the ground, you're not going to be heroes. You're going to be ghosts." The man hesitated. A flicker of doubt passed over his face, the first crack in his resolve. That was the leverage I needed. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small, unassuming device, a prototype transmitter that looked like a simple key fob. "I've been broadcasting your signal since the moment you stepped into this row," I lied with the ease of a veteran liar. "Every move you've made, every word you've spoken, is being logged by the internal security team. You aren't taking this plane anywhere." He stared at me, his eyes darting to the overhead storage bins as if expecting a tactical team to drop from the ceiling. It was enough of a distraction. I lunged, not away from him, but toward him. I tackled him just as he fired, the bullet shattering a nearby window. The sound was instantaneous, a deafening, ear-piercing scream of air as the cabin began to decompress. Papers, personal belongings, and oxygen masks began to whip around in a violent, swirling cyclone of air. People were screaming, clutching their seats as the plane took a sharp, erratic dive. The sudden loss of pressure forced everyone to grab their masks, the cabin filling with the chaotic hiss of emergency air. I was pinned to the floor by the pressure difference, struggling to keep my grip on the bag as the man crawled toward me, his face turning blue from the lack of oxygen. I reached out for the emergency handle to lock the cabin, but the force of the wind made it impossible. Suddenly, a third person emerged from the shadows near the cockpit door. They weren't wearing a uniform. They were wearing a tactical vest, their face obscured by a balaclava, and they were pointing a heavy, modified weapon directly at the center of the cabin. They weren't looking at the hijackers. They were looking at me. They fired, and the sound was muffled by the roar of the wind as the glass above me exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. The bullet didn't hit me. It hit the hydraulic locking mechanism of the emergency partition, shattering the bolt and forcing the heavy, reinforced door to slam shut. The sudden change in airflow caused the cabin pressure to stabilize as the emergency seals engaged, the deafening roar of the depressurization instantly cutting to a terrifying, ringing silence. The person in the tactical vest didn't hesitate. They moved with a fluid, terrifying efficiency, ignoring the hijackers entirely and vaulting over the rows of seats. With a single, brutal movement, they disarmed the man with the scar, pinning him to the floor with a knee to his throat, while simultaneously securing the other assailant with zip ties retrieved from their belt. It wasn't a mercenary. It was a recovery asset, someone from my own agency, someone I hadn't seen in 3 years. Agent Miller. He looked at me, his eyes hard and unblinking beneath the balaclava. He didn't offer a hand to help me up. In our world, sentimentality is a luxury that gets people killed. He simply nodded toward the rear of the plane. "The pilot is neutralized. The co-pilot is back in control," he said, his voice clipped and efficient. "We have 10 minutes before local authorities in Nairobi surround the tarmac. You have the drive?" I clutched the bag, my knuckles white. "I have it. But Sarah, the flight attendant, she's been compromised. She knows too much." Miller turned his gaze toward Sarah, who was shivering in the aisle, her mind clearly broken by the violence she had just witnessed. Miller pulled a small silver injector from his kit. My stomach dropped. I knew what it was, a fast-acting sedative designed for sensitive situations. "She doesn't know anything," Miller said coldly. "She just had a traumatic event involving a violent passenger who thought he was a hero. When she wakes up in the medical bay, she'll remember a robbery, a struggle, and a very vivid, stress-induced hallucination about a woman who fought back. We're scrubbing the manifest, and her memory will be adjusted accordingly." I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I looked down at Sarah, who was already beginning to drift into a catatonic state as Miller approached her. It felt cruel, but in this profession, the truth is often the most dangerous variable. The plane began its descent, the lights of Nairobi flickering like embers in the distance. The transition from the chaos of the hijacking to the silence of the aftermath was jarring. Miller stayed by my side, a silent guardian ensuring that the mission, the real mission, reached the ground safely. When we finally touched down, the runway was swarming with local law enforcement and our own Black Ops cleanup crew. The hijackers were dragged off the plane in hoods, their faces hidden, their identities effectively erased from the record before they even hit the asphalt. I was escorted down the stairs, the cool night air biting at my skin. As I walked, I saw Sarah being carried out on a stretcher, her eyes closed, her expression peaceful. She would survive. She would keep her job, and she would carry the memory of a hero who she thought had been a stranger, never knowing that the woman she had harassed for her appearance was the very person who had saved her life. Miller leaned in close as we reached the perimeter of the secure zone. "You did well, Elena. The internal security check will be handled in Geneva. The organization is dismantled, and the evidence you brought in is going to trigger a dozen investigations." "What happens now?" I asked, looking back at the plane, now stripped of its passengers and luggage. "Now, you disappear," he replied, handing me a fresh passport and a new itinerary. "The world thinks you're just another corporate consultant who got lucky during a robbery. You're going back to the office, you're getting a promotion, and you're going to continue being the ghost they all underestimate." I took the documents. I felt the weight of the last 24 hours in every fiber of my being. The fear, the adrenaline, the moral compromise of leaving Sarah in the dark. But as I walked away from the tarmac and toward the anonymity of a new life, I allowed myself a single, fleeting smile. They had looked at me and seen a target. They had seen a stereotype. And by the time they realized what I really was, it was far too late for them to do anything about it. I climbed into the waiting sedan, the engine purring to life, and as the Nairobi skyline blurred into the background, I finally let myself breathe. The mission was over, the ghosts were satisfied, and I was exactly where I needed to be, invisible, protected, and ready for whatever came next.